In this chapter, we're going to take a look at histology. Histology is the microscopic study of tissues. And recall that tissues are a group of cells that perform a common function. There are 4 types of tissues found in the human body. The first tissue is called epithelial tissue. The second tissue is called connective tissue. The third tissue is muscular tissue. And the fourth tissue is nervous tissue. In this chapter, we're going to discuss epithelial tissue and connective tissue extensively. For muscle tissue and nervous tissue, we'll briefly touch upon those, but discuss those more extensively in future chapters. The first type of tissue that we're going to discuss is epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue has 6 functions. The first function is to cover organs and structures. The second function is to line cavities and passageways. The third function is for protection. The fourth function allows diffusion and osmosis, and remember that diffusion and osmosis is the movement of materials or water from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. The fifth function is to allow for filtration, which is the separation of materials by size. And the last function is to allow for secretion, which is the production and release of substances. Epithelial tissue is composed of epithelial cells. And when you take a closer look at epithelial cells, at least in this image or in this diagram, has 3 sides. The first side of an epithelial cell is called the apical surface. The second side is called the lateral surface, and the third side is called the basal surface. The apical surface is also known as the free surface. And the apical surface can look like or contain the following. It can be a smooth surface. It can contain cilia, which are finger-like projections that help move substances across the apical surface. It can contain microvilli, which increase the surface area for maximum absorption. Or it can contain goblet cells, which are cells that secrete mucus. The second type of cell surface is the lateral surface, or basically the sides of the epithelial cell. And on the lateral surface, you'll see connectors or connections between adjacent cells. And there are 3 types of connections that you would find on the lateral surface. The first type is called a tight junction. The second type is called the desmosome, and the third type is called the gap junction. A tight junction is where 2 lateral surfaces of adjacent epithelial cells have fused together. A desmosome is a special type of connector that allows tissues to stretch. And finally, a gap junction consists of a protein tunnel which allows substances to pass between the 2 adjacent cells. The last cell surface is the basal surface, and the basal surface is the surface adjacent to connective tissue. The basal surface is anchored to connective tissue by a structure called the basement membrane, and one type of connector called a hemidesmosome. A hemidesmosome is similar in function to a desmosome. It allows the tissue to stretch. So taking one last look at an epithelial cell, again, this surface is called the apical surface. You have the lateral surface and the basal surface. And on the lateral surface, you'll find connectors, the tight junction, a gap junction, and a desmosome. And on the basal surface, you'll find a hemidesmosome. Epithelial tissue is classified by 2 things. The first is by the number of layers, and the second is by the shape of the cell. When looking at the number of layers of epithelial tissue, a single layer is a simple epithelial tissue, and multiple layers is a stratified epithelial tissue. And finally, when classifying by shape, a flat cell, or a cell that is wider than it is tall, is classified as a squamous cell. A cell that is shaped like a cube, or is tall as it is wide, is classified as a cuboidal cell. And finally, a rectangular shaped cell, or a cell that is taller than it is wide, is classified as a columnar cell. When naming and identifying epithelial tissue, the number of layers comes first and the shape of the cell comes second. such as simple squamous or stratified squamous. The list below are the epithelial tissues that we'll be studying in this chapter. For the next set of slides, you'll be asked to identify a type of epithelial tissue based on your keen observations. Name this tissue. A single layer of rectangular shaped cells. This type of tissue can be found on the inner lining of digestive system passageways such as the small intestine. The name of this tissue is simple columnar. Name this tissue. Multiple layers of cube-shaped cells. This type of tissue can be found in the urinary bladder. The name of this tissue is stratified cuboidal or transitional. Name this tissue. A single layer of flat cells. This tissue makes up the walls of the alveoli, which are tiny little sacs found in the lungs. The name of the tissue is simple squamous. Name this tissue. You see in this tissue there are multiple layers of both flat and cube-shaped cells. This type of epithelial tissue makes up the outer layer of the skin. The name of this tissue is stratified squamous. When naming stratified epithelial tissue, the second name comes from the shapes of the cells that are furthest away from connective tissue. In the image above, squamous cells are furthest away from the connective tissue, which is why this tissue is called stratified squamous. Finally, name this tissue. I'm not going to lie, this tissue is going to be tricky. In this image, you see a single layer of rectangular shaped cells that give the appearance of being more than one layer. This type of epithelial tissue you will find lining the trachea or the windpipe of the respiratory system. The name of this tissue is pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. The columnar part of the name is easy to understand, the rectangular shaped cells. However, where does pseudostratified come from? Pseudo means false. Pseudostratified means falsely layered or giving the appearance that it could be layered. Pseudostratified epithelial tissue looks like it's layered, but really it is not. It's a single layer of epithelial cells. If you notice in the image, every single cell touches the basement membrane. For the next class meeting, be ready to discuss the following. How does the number of layers and shapes of epithelial cells determines the function of the epithelial tissue?